Please welcome to the stage the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola.
Good afternoon. Thank you all, and thank you to the Clinton Global Initiative for the invitation to be here today. I am grateful to be here to speak to you all as the President of the European Parliament, an institution that has become, I'm proud to say, a worldwide symbol of living democracy, of parliamentarism, of the way that we can build bridges across traditional political divisions, across different cultures, countries, and even languages. We've just emerged from our election cycle where some 400 million people were eligible to vote for their representatives across 27 EU member states. And there's nothing like an election to focus minds and to show the urgency of civic engagement. In the European Parliament, we have learned the need to keep reminding people of why democracy matters to everyday lives. And it is becoming harder than it should be. Perhaps we took it for granted for far too long, only to now be confronted with a reality, with new generations of voters who, despite having all the information of the world at their fingertips, or perhaps because of that, are feeling more disenfranchised, more lonely, more skeptical than at any other time, in my memory at least. We've witnessed the rise of the extremes, and while the constructive center held in Europe, far too many people, far too many thought that their only option was to vote with the fringes. And that is a message that we ignore at our peril. Now, for someone like me who remembers the literal split of Europe, when the only factor that determined whether you had rights or not was whether you were born on the left or the right side of a wall, the virtues of a democracy for people my age may seem obvious. But for most young people I meet across Europe, and I suspect that it's the same also here, do not remember a world when democracy was under threat. They simply do not have the reference points like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the return of freedom to Central and Eastern Europe. It is not enough anymore to just expect people to understand the value of democracy if we do not remind them of its value to their lives every day. And democracy must be able to provide prosperity and security. It must ensure dignity. It must ensure rights. It must guarantee that people have the chance to fulfill their potential. It must be visible, and they must feel it. It must be tangible. And that is our job as politicians, as activists and organizers, as leaders. We must do much better at getting the process closer to people. Democracy needs to be our answer to those people who feel abandoned, who feel squeezed out of the economic middle. It must be our answer to those who feel helpless and hopeless, to those who feel the world has gone on without them, or who have seen the fabric of their communities change too fast. Now, democracy cannot be simply an academic process. Everyone must feel involved. Otherwise, we will simply watch in bewilderment as we risk losing a generation to the false safety net of populism, to the easy answers to impossible questions that dominate the TikTok politics we see too much of, or to the struggling and shrugging disillusionment of not voting at all. And I think that when it is seen from that perspective, with some honest reflection, it becomes easier to understand how the appeal of democracy, the struggle to maintain it, can no longer be about abstract appeals. Just look at Ukraine, a nation fighting not only for its survival, but for the freedom of its people, for the democracy that we take as a given. And how the rest of the world responds matters. Do we stand with those defending the principles upon which our way of life was built on, or not? To me and to the European Parliament, it is clear. We must stand with Ukraine, and we will do so for as long as it takes. Because that is what is fundamentally in our best interest, because our way of life deserves it, and because our rhetoric must be matched with our action. We will need to start speaking louder about what we are for and what we stand for. We need to inspire the next generations to look at politics as a force for positive change, as a cause for hope, rather than the opposite. I started my political career about 2 decades ago as a younger woman with no backing, no funding, no network, with more doors slammed in my face than were opened. But what I did have was a great deal of optimism, of belief. And that is what still drives me today. I think we could use a little bit more of that sense of hope in our politics today, of pragmatism, of a better understanding of what makes people frustrated with our systems, and understandably so, of filling the gap between what they expect and what we can deliver, of explaining honestly, of celebrating our successes, but admitting the failings of our ways too, of pushing back against the polarization and entrenchment that we see too much of, and of rediscovering the benefits of political compromises that we see too little of. Perhaps it is time to reclaim the strong political center as the backbone of a reimagined third way that this generation is calling out for, to underline the need to support the modernizers, the innovators, the risk takers, rather than those who seek to undermine and destroy. It takes leaders, it takes politicians, but it also takes you, community leaders, the business communities, local grassroots groups, and activists, to lead the shift away from the comfort of easy cynicism towards looking at politics as a force for positive change, to beat back against complacency. This will require patience, it will require leadership, but I'm confident that we will get there. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage from Renew America Together, General Wesley Clark.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, God. I appreciate it. And look, I was on an airplane the other day, and I saw a movie. Some of you may have seen it. It's called Civil War. Anybody seen it? Yeah, a few of you. It didn't get good reviews. The reviewers were really perplexed. They said, they're showing these scenes of people killing each other, but they never explain why. You see, that's the real lesson in the movie. It doesn't require a reason. It just requires a breakdown. And in this case, it's fiction for America. But it's happened in many other countries. I've seen it in Kosovo. I've seen it in Bosnia. It happened in India in the separation. And it's happening today all over the world. It's violent. It's banal. It's horrible. We can't have it here. But America, we do have a problem, because over the last decade and a half or so, the country seems just to have become increasingly divided on partisan terms. I was giving a speech up in Connecticut a few years ago, and somebody said, "Oh boy, great speech, you should run for president." I said, "Well, I've done that already. I've got the t-shirt. It says, 'Bark for Clark.'" and a picture of a dog. And so I'm not going to run for president again, but I think maybe there is a way to help. And we established a little organization called Renew America Together. I went with Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, just to make sure he had some balance on it. He says, whatever you do, use the word renew. It's critical. So it's Renew America Together. We thought we would begin by trying to explain that in politics, in a democracy, well, the basic rule is you have to be different from your opponent. It's what Congressman Chet Edwards from Texas told me after I had run unsuccessfully. He said, look, 3 rules of politics: define yourself, define your opponent, and react quickly to attacks. Well, if that's the way politics works, then it's natural that if you say the sky's red, he's going to say the sky's blue, and you're going to get 2 sides. And we believe that through this differentiation, we could somehow come together and find common interest, common purpose, working together. That's the theory of representative democracy. That's the theory we live under. But somehow it's polluted somehow, and people didn't understand it. So with our foundation, we thought we'd bring post-partisan Republicans and Democrats out, people who'd been in office, people who'd been in that political system, people who could explain to the American public, look, what holds us together as Americans, our common beliefs, are much more important than the more superficial reasons we give you to elect us, one or the other. And yet, we found it was also pretty hard to find post-partisan politicians, because by the time someone's been through 20, 30 years of partisan politics, we're pretty embedded in who you are and your identity. So it's pretty hard to stand back from it. But these town hall meetings that we were doing were important. Then I thought back to my own Army experience. You know, after the Vietnam War, we realized we had to rebuild the Army. And we said, you know, we've always got pretty good leaders at the top. They're college educated, and we have a schooling system for them. But what makes the unit good, it's not the leadership necessarily, although a bad leader could destroy it, but it's the quality of the soldiers in the unit. If you want a great unit, have great soldiers. And I think the same principle is true about democracies. If you want a great democracy, have great citizens, people who understand it, people who communicate together, people who understand that despite differences of opinion, what holds them together is greater than these political differences. And so we started a program to reach out to the grassroots. And so we called it the Civility Leadership Institute. We set up a curriculum. We started with having people learn who they are with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator test and learn how they communicate with others. We gave them simple communications drills, and we found out, amazingly, people from diverse backgrounds, African Americans, white, North, South, religious, non-religious, put them together, let them work together on common problems, and pretty soon they're good friends, sometimes best friends. So it's a workable model. We've got a curriculum now that's available. We want it to go out and reach across the country. We've got a problem. We've got to pull people together in this country. But I want to say that what we're going to do today is also talk about some of the great leaders that have transcended the political bounds. And today it's my pleasure to introduce 2 of them. And I'd like to begin by introducing Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
Thank you.
Gretchen. Governor Whitmer she's a lifelong public servant. She's been in the Michigan legislature. She's been a senator there. She's worked on the Democratic National Committee, and she's a distinguished governor, and she's doing a great job handling Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And I'd like to introduce my friend, my Arkansas governor, Asa Hutchinson. Asa is a Republican. He's a lifelong public servant. He was a congressman. He was in the Department of Homeland Security. He was 8 years as governor, got more votes than any Republican governor ever got, left office after 2 years, after 2 terms, term limited. He strengthened public education. He put tax cuts in. He saved our rural hospitals in America. He was incredibly popular as a governor, and he worked across the line. He was a 2024 candidate for the Republican nomination for president. Asa, I'll tell you, as an Arkansan and as an American, we're really proud of you. Thank you for joining us here. And I think there's no better person to help foster this dialogue than my friend Ian Bremmer, who's the chairman and CEO of the Eurasia Group. You've seen Ian Bremmer on television. He advises governments all over the world. He's written 11 books. He's with Time magazine and writing articles. He's the expert. He's a political scientist. He's a keen student of data and a keen student of human nature. Please welcome Ian Bremmer. Thank you.
Thank you, General. So we have a Republican, a Democrat, someone that's never been in a political party, but for the next 30 minutes, we are going to work together. And the topic is trying to rebuild civic engagement in our democracy, something that right now, at least, does not appear to be the direction that we are generally heading. So maybe I want to start. As governors, we had a little conversation behind stage where one of you brought up that the National Governors Association is one of the few places that we can still see the spirit of bipartisanship. You both agree with that. Talk about how that is and why you think that is. Asa, please.
Well, first of all, governors have to get things done. You actually have to be accountable, you set goals, and if you don't, you're voted out of office. It's just that simple as governor. And so whenever the governors get together as Democrats, Republicans, I think we might have an independent in there, but we share ideas, and whenever you're looking at education, there are some differences between the parties and between the governors, but there's so much we agree upon. And when you're looking at going through the pandemic, particularly the National Governors Association, in a bipartisan way, both in a Democrat administration and a Republican administration, we had weekly calls, we were all together, we exchanged ideas, and no one cared what the label was. And so, sure, there's areas of disagreement, but we were able to work together. And I'll just tell you, it was fun listening on one of the calls. You might have remembered that when President Trump chewed out Governor Kemp for opening up tattoo parlors. So, you know, there's some fun parts of it as well. That was a call that I remember I'll never forget.
And I would just add, you know, Asa was our chair during 1 year of the pandemic, and so I'm thrilled to hear kind of his observations. I would just share this. During the pandemic, I would regularly convene the Midwest governors to touch base. We were all building a plane as we were flying it, and you know, without a lot of great assistance and direction from the federal government. So we were kind of on our own. And there were few people that understood all the different pressures that we were each individually navigating. And that's why having our Midwest governors talking regularly is J.B. Pritzker and Tim Walz and Tony Evers, but also Eric Holcomb from Indiana and Mike DeWine from Ohio. We, you know, helped one another. And when Mike DeWine is sharing his best intel about how to combat the pandemic, I'm benefiting from, and the people of Michigan are benefiting from the best of the Cleveland Clinic that was advising him, and vice versa. The people of Ohio got the best of the University of Michigan epidemiologists and healthcare. And while Ohioans don't generally love the University of Michigan, they were grateful to have the council because it was, you know, so important, and we had one another, and we worked really closely together. And when they needed masks and we were able to get them to them, we helped one another in that way too. And so I do think that an organization of executives who all have to, Asa says, get things done. I say GSD, and the S isn't for stuff. But we all have that same mindset. We got to deliver. We've got to, at the end of the day, have balanced budgets and get things done for people.
Look, I mean, this was the crisis that all Americans experienced. It was more disruptive than anything else that most of us have had happen in our lives. And you were responsible for trying to get us through it. Now, the experience a lot of Americans had as we went through the pandemic was it got politicized. Whether you're talking about the CDC or Dr. Fauci or wearing masks or having vaccines or all of that. As we worked through it, was your experience in the NGA, was your experience as governors markedly different, markedly less partisan than that? And what lessons can we, if any, learn from that? Maybe you go first, Fred.
I would say it was markedly less partisan. It really was. It was so helpful for me to have perspective of my colleagues. And when my legislature started, once I was singled out by, the former president of the White House, it kind of changed the political dynamic on the ground in Michigan for me. My legislature started suing me to take away my powers, and there were all sorts of things that were happening in Michigan. But when I would talk to Mike DeWine and Eric Holcomb or Andy Beshear, who we adopted into the Midwest, even though he's from Kentucky, I would understand that, while it was harder and heavier in Michigan because of the partisan issues at the ground, Mike DeWine was dealing that from his legislature too. So that was intra-party, and that gave me tremendous perspective that I wouldn't have had if I wasn't regularly talking with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And so I do think we, as a group, were able to navigate without the insidious partisanship tearing us apart.
Crisis leadership?
I agree 100% with Gretchen. Of course, I'm in the South, and I think about John Bel Edwards, Democrat governor of Louisiana, when they got hit hard and they were strained with having sufficient equipment and PPE there. I called him up and said, we're going to send you some of our equipment down to Louisiana. And of course, that has been reciprocated as well. But also, when you look at the different administrations, there were differences in approach as to how the states were utilized in the different administrations. And that changed, but the communication continued. The willingness to help was true in both administrations. I think that when Jeff Zients was chief of staff, I dealt with him. I was chairman of the NGA, and I'd say, why can't you do it this way? He said, we can't do it that way. And we understood the differences, and we worked through all of that. To me, that's true differences and bipartisan differences working together to get it done in a way that serves our people.
I mean, when I see the House of Representatives, I see some members where the overlap in the Venn diagram of the circle seems to be almost nil. Can you say that feels, given what you're sharing about COVID, and just generally your colleagues, that just isn't true when we talk about the executives for state governance in the United States? Would you agree with that?
I do, and what you got to worry about is that the partisanship that you see in Washington, D.C. starts permeating the states. And part of that challenge is the nationalization of our politics. When I ran for governor, I was putting computer science in every school. I was having an income tax cut, and I wanted to address the size of state government, local issues. But today, you might be running for county commissioner, and you're getting asked about immigration policy. You're getting asked about, do you support the war in Ukraine or not, because of the nationalization of the issue. So I'm worried about the states continuing with what we've enjoyed, which is bipartisanship, working hard to get things done regardless, and working across the aisle.
Now, Gretchen, we don't have a pandemic to continue to get us working that way. When you look at the major issues that are in front of us right now, defined in the presidential election, but more broadly, where do you think the opportunity for that kind of operational bipartisanship is greatest, and why?
Well, you know, as we think about so many of the universal issues that we're confronting as a country, there should be some areas where it is not inherently political. It feels like everything is right now, but when we think about infrastructure, that is a need all across the country. It should not be, it's not a Republican bridge or a Democratic bridge. We need access to the internet. We need to make sure that, you know, we've got safe roads and bridges across this country. We need clean drinking water for people in this country. And I tend to stay focused on the dinner table issues because I do think that that's where we have the greatest opportunity to find common ground. But I do think that one of the issues that we're all confronting, and probably many, if not all, facets of our individual lives, is, you know, the lack of ability to get to know each other. You know, the inability to see the humanity in someone else or have a conversation. We're getting information from devices and getting angry at something without picking up the phone and calling someone and saying, what's going on here? Help me understand, like Asa was just talking about. When you're not even talking to one another, how can you ever find common ground? And so one of the things that I'm always, you know, desperately trying to get people to do is to see the humanity in one another, to have conversations, ask those questions. What do you need in your life? What's not working for you? So that we can stay focused on where we can get things done and find common ground working with people on the other side of the aisle doing it.
Hey, so what do you do to reach out? I mean, so much of this is about leadership. It's about like seeing in your executive someone that you feel like even if they may be on the other side, I can engage with that person. He'll listen to me. She'll listen to me.
Well, in Arkansas, we have a Republican majority in the legislature, but notwithstanding that, I needed Democrat votes on a whole host of issues because it takes 3/4 of our legislature to pass an appropriation bill. How would you like to have that standard in Washington, D.C.? And it's not just because I needed the vote, but it was just, my belief is, and I was Republican Party chairman in Arkansas, former President Bill Clinton would certainly attest to my partisanship at times, but you compete in the political arena, and when the election is over with, you convene together and you coalesce around ideas that you can work on. Those are the 3 C's to me. And so you set that aside. My door was open to Democrats, Republicans. Whenever we had Medicaid expansion in Arkansas, we worked together on that in a bipartisan way. And so that's what you do in state government. And so one, the door is open. You include them on the discussions. And I believe that true bipartisanship is not coming up with a bill and taking it to the other side and saying, can you support this? True bipartisanship is working together as you develop that legislation or plan and reach an agreement as you go along. And that's what I think is most important.
So in our last sort of 10 minutes here, I want to move a little from being governors to talking about the state of our democracy. As we've got a big election coming up in just a few weeks. Democracy is on the ballot, though very few voters think it's the most important issue on the ballot. Should it be? Is it the most important issue on the ballot? How should we think about what we are voting for, what the state of American democracy is right now? Gretchen.
I think it is. I think it's hugely important, but I also recognize that the average person in this country is working their tail off, just trying to get home from work and get food on the table, get the kids to bed and off to school the next day. And so they don't, not that they're not smart enough, not that they don't care, but it's a simple bandwidth question. Are they able to get all the information that they need? And I think that's where it's incumbent on us to make it easier for people to digest everything that's happening. But I do think that people care about it. They also need to be able to know that they've got a path to prosperity, and that's why I think the dinner table issues are always going to be front and center for people, especially that are having a hard time putting food on the table in the first place.
Asa?
Democracy is always at stake in every election in America. Obviously, in this day and time, in this election, it's even at a higher level of risk. And I put it that primarily it's because our institutions of democracy are under attack. And whenever you look at the attacks on the judicial system, undermining jury verdicts, whenever you look at the lack of confidence in Congress or the courts, or law enforcement. These are institutions that are critical for a democracy functioning. And I agree with Gretchen that they're thinking, the voters are thinking about what's a loaf of bread cost, but in the larger scale, leaders need to protect the institutions of our democracy, and I think that's what's at stake today. I'll just end by saying I've had 8 years as governor, 1 year campaigning across America that nobody noticed. If I'd have had a crowd like this in Iowa, I might still be going. But people ask me, well, what did you learn from that or observe? And there's one fundamental point, and that is that the people of America care about our future. And that ought to be, that we disagree on approaches, we have disagreements, but people care. And I think that's encouraging and optimistic about our democracy.
Asa, what motivated you? I mean, you know, you had a very successful background, storied political career. You didn't need to do this. What motivated you to say, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to actually put myself out there, I'm going to launch this campaign? I'm asking you in part because I'm interested, and in part because there might be someone else on this stage that is also considering these things going forward.
Well, I just wanted you to absorb that moment there. Well, first of all, this is a unique time. I can think of 50 things that I could have done different, and none of them would have made a difference. Everybody that ran against a brick wall, Donald Trump. So I ran because I believe that truth is important. I believe that you have to provide alternatives, and that this is a critical time. Secondly, whenever you realize, well, I might not be successful in this, that's when leadership changes its form. As governors, we're about change leadership, crisis leadership. Well, right now in the Republican Party, it's about dissension leadership, where you are the dissenting voice, just like John Marshall Harlan, who dissented in Plessy v. Ferguson as a Supreme Court justice. And he was the only one, but dissenting leadership became governing leadership. It changed society. So it's important for leaders today to dissent when it's a matter of conviction and to speak the truth.
Are you proudest? That's well put. Are you proudest, too, when you were standing on that stage in that presidential debate, when you look back on it, to be the voice of dissenting leadership?
Absolutely. I mean, I dissented when I said I would not vote for a convicted felon for President of the United States. It was not a hard call. So yeah, I mean, I love my colleagues, I love my friends, I'm still a Republican, but truth is important, and I'm a rule of law guy, a lawyer, former federal prosecutor, and too much is, you just can't go along with it.
So Gretchen,
he's a man of integrity.
So you're not getting that softball, okay?
I'm not voting for Donald Trump either.
Exactly. But when I look at the topic that we're discussing today, we've had a few administrations from different political parties. I think we'd all agree they're very different human beings, and yet civic engagement, bipartisan spirit, the state of U.S. democracy has not seemed to get better irrespective of those approaches. So what I want to ask you, Gretchen, you're not running, but you got a stake. You look at the next president of the United States, what do we need to see? What are a thing or two concrete that might happen so that in 4 years' time when we come back, we're having a different conversation?
Well, I mean, I think the outcome of this election is going to put us on a trajectory, and the question is, what trajectory are we going to be on? And that's part of why I think this is such a high-stakes moment in our country. And as I, look at my own kids who are 22 and 20 years old, I sometimes have to remind myself to explain to them that this is not normal. Where we are is not how discourse has always been in America. Watching the debate like we did, together, that's not what a typical presidential debate used to look like. And that it's important for us to where we have platforms to model what we revere about this country and robust debates in our nation. It is also important for us to find people that we can praise on the other side of the aisle, to recognize that we are a country that is stronger when we have robust debate based on a same set of facts, but very different sets of viewpoints and ways of addressing the issues that we're all confronting in this country. So I do think that there is a lot of work that we all can play a role in getting us to a place where our democracy is the type that we can all be proud of and yields the results that most of us want, and that is a better life for people in this country.
So last question for both of you, which is, in an environment where people are thinking a lot about the issues, the economy, but a lot of Americans no longer know what the United States stands for, no longer knows what the values are, aren't convinced that we're the good guys. What do we do to infuse what America stands for with the average Americans, which I know you're trying to do in your states and in your work, but more broadly, any lessons that we can close to share? I'll start with you.
Well, it comes down to leadership, and we've had times of division all through our history. But the difference is that our leaders tried to overcome the disagreements and bring people together, and today we have too many leaders that further the divide, that make money off of the divide, and that's the challenge, and that can only be reversed by leadership. And I want to have leadership in America that brings out the best of our country, brings out the best of our people. When that happens, the world will see it. And foreign policy should be based upon strength, but it should also be based upon goodness. And the goodness of America that's been demonstrated throughout our history in terms of World War II and supporting our allies. Restoring that friendship ought to be part of our goodness.
Gretchen, I'll give you the last word.
I think, an honest assessment of where we are, what we need to do, and a more robust education when it comes to civics and the role of the public in our political discourse and in the direction of our country. And I think accountability.
Please join me in thanking Governors Hutchinson and Whitmer. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Stephen Green from the UK Year of Service. Stephen.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Green. I'm one of the directors of UK Year of Service. I'm a volunteer. It's really a privilege to be with you all here. It's humbling. What a glorious gathering. What works? Youth service, national service, citizen service. We believe a UK Year of Service is the future. But first, let me go back. In 1995, I was working at the Fowler Center, a nonprofit in Mayville, Michigan. We were one of the first pilot sites of AmeriCorps that President Clinton had started the year before. Standing here today, AmeriCorps has now seen 1,300,000 members through the program. 1,300,000 members. That's a big number, but think about it. That's 1,300,000 young people working in community centers, in schools, providing comfort and disaster relief in all 50 states. It's incredible. AmeriCorps works. Well, I was born in America. I now call Britain home. It's a wonderful place to live and work. But it's a challenging time for our young people. Today, 900,000 British youth are not in education, employment, or training. They're adrift. On the other side, the country's short 6,000 teachers, 12,000 health and social care workers, and we have thousands of green jobs that are unfilled as the country tries to get to its commitment to be net zero by 2050. Those are really big numbers in a country of 60 million. But you know what does work? AmeriCorps. In France, Service Civic. In Germany, a free year. And dozens of other service programs around the world. The UK needs its own year of service. Britain needs a UK year of service. We're building on the great work of CityYear UK, another impactful US export. CityYear UK is 15 years old this year and is opening up a new city in the home of the Beatles in Liverpool. We're calling on everybody in the UK, CityYear and a wide coalition. We're calling on our government, our nonprofit community, and our business partners to join us. We already have great partners in Barclays, Sky, the British Chambers of Commerce, business in the community. We need everybody to support this need. National service just works. In our pilot that we've been running the last couple of years, 9 out of 10 in that cohort are now in full-time employment or education. Before they did their service, thank you, it's them, but before they did their service, 6 out of those 10 were adrift. They were on unemployment benefits, and many of them in long-term unemployment. So we know it works, but let me tell you one story. A young woman named Hanan, she did her service for the British Red Cross, supporting refugees. She was the first person, no one from her family had ever been to university, and this month she's starting a BSc in International Disaster Management at University of Manchester. We need to create thousands of Hanans. So inspired by AmeriCorps, inspired by President Clinton, today we're announcing a Clinton Global Initiative commitment to action to work towards a UK year of service that has 4,000 members per year. We're close. We need everybody's help. And we're committing that in the next 12 months, we'll have 60 engaged politicians, 140 business partners, and 75 program delivery partners. This is a public-private partnership that returns millions of pounds into the UK economy. But really what it is a domestic army for good. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Maya McGuinness, Reed Ribble, Carolyn Bordeaux, and Marjorie Margolis.
Thank you. It's so nice to be with everybody today. I'm really pleased as the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget today to be announcing here and launching a public education effort that is very, very consistent with our mission of fiscal responsibility, fiscal sustainability, and bipartisanship, and really dealing with the trade-offs and some of the choices we have to make for a more prosperous, a future filled with more prosperity, driven by taking on the responsibility that we need to today in order to get there. So I'm really thrilled because we haven't had a budget surplus since 2001 to be focusing again on bringing people together as we did in the past when we turned our budget from big deficits to big surpluses through a whole network of discussions across the country at presidential libraries, at universities, bringing in former members of Congress and people with differing perspectives, but to show that we can again come together to make the choices to fix a situation which right now is really quite dangerous in the fact that our fiscal situation is such that our interest payments are the fastest growing part of our federal budget. They are larger than national defense, and they are larger than all the money we spend on children at the federal level. We have the largest deficits we've ever had in peacetime, and our debt is about to be at the record levels, only seen this high before, right after World War II. We have to make these changes because right now, the way that our debt is, it's an economic risk, it's a national security risk, it's an intergenerational risk, and it leaves us unable to be nimble enough to deal with the threats and opportunities as they come along. But the reason I'm so excited today is this entire conference is so upbeat, filled with people who are doing things, getting engaged, making a difference, which is the key to all of these challenges. And I'm really pleased today to be with 3 former members who have all, in their time in Congress, worked on these issues and made the difference. We know it can be done. We're looking forward to doing it again and very glad to launch this new effort today. The final thing is that in just a few months, we will be holding, as part of this, the first fiscal State of the Union. And we will be holding a nationwide conference looking at fiscal turnarounds, how we've done this around the world in the past, and the lessons that we can learn. So thank you, and I'd like to turn it over to the person who thought of this whole idea, Marjorie.
Let me tell you how it happened. We had a board meeting. There are 30 people on the board. 22 of us are former members, mostly people who dealt with financial issues on different committees. After one of the board meetings, I said, you know, we really should do Clinton Global Initiative. And one of our members, he will remain nameless, really great guy, said, we don't want to tell the world what a terrible, how much we owe and how bad we are. And Maya said, she's frighteningly smart. I mean, she's annoyingly smart. Maya said, we have to step up to the plate and we've got to tell folks out there what's going on. Walking by was Tim Penny, as in Penny Kasich. You may remember that piece of legislation. And he said, you know, it's been more than 20 years since we had a balanced budget, and it was because of Bill Clinton. So we really should be celebrating. And I spoke to the president recently, and I said, you should, he said, I'm not going to be patting myself on the back, but we had a balanced budget and we had a surplus. You know that. And that's what we're trying to address. We are giving to our children and our grandchildren a painful, frightening thing to handle, a debt that is just appalling, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to be realistic, and we want to present it, and we want to figure out how we can start to have the conversation, the international conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Bordeaux, the former Congresswoman from Georgia's 7th Congressional District. And prior to serving in Congress, I had served as director of the Georgia Senate Budget and Evaluation Office. And I helped the state of Georgia balance the budget during the Great Recession. And these processes were enormously politically fraught. But these budgets passed, and they passed despite a lot of political and emotional difficulty by broad and bipartisan majorities. And they were on time, they were on budget. So you can imagine my shock when I came to Congress and found out that Congress had not adopted a budget on time in 21 years since Congresswoman Margolis-Mavinsky worked on it. Congress has not passed all appropriations bills on time in 27 years. Congress has used continuing resolutions every fiscal year since 2000. We are running $1.7 trillion annual deficits and, of course, have $35 trillion in national debt. And this is such a big number that it's very hard for people to even get their arms around it. But we need to think of this challenge as a problem similar to pandemic preparedness or climate change. It's hard to know when the crisis will hit, how it will hit, but we do know at some point it will come. And every cause that we all care about, those discussed at this conference, will be compromised, perhaps disastrously so, if the United States of America hits a really serious fiscal crisis. And this is why, during my time in Congress, I focused on this work in a bipartisan way, working with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. You would be surprised at how many people are aware of this problem. Concern about the national debt is actually a top polling issue, although people disagree about the path to confront it. But we do need to move it to the front burner for policymakers. And that's why, I am so pleased to be a part of this effort, which is bipartisan and is a real push to bring this to the forefront of our national conversation. Thank you.
I get to provide the hardest message. The unfunded portion of obligation that we have for our two major entitlement programs exceeds $106 trillion. That's the piece that's not funded. And so therefore you cannot fix Social Security and Medicare just by raising taxes. You can't fix them just by changing programs without increasing senior poverty by 100%. And so we're embarking on an education program to begin to show the American people what the actual fiscal status of the country is and what reforms are necessary by engaging them, by using a tool that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget did to calculate what it would take in real time to fix these programs like Social Security. You can put it right up on a screen. You can have someone stand up and say, what would you do? And they say, raise taxes or eliminate the cap, and you can show exactly how much that would fix. And what they find very quickly is we have a problem that is enormous and one that our grandchildren deserve a fix for because they are now without representation. And so thank you for spending some time with us today and letting us bring this to you. And we hope to partner with you in trying to get some of this education done and the reforms necessary to get us set on the right path. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back. I hope that's okay. We have a, oh, thank you. So we now have a panel, and to the best of my knowledge, none of them is actually running for anything, but we'll find out if that's not true. I'm delighted to introduce them, though. We have Neil Bush, who's the chair of Points of Light. Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center. And Damola Ogundipe, who is CEO of Pluro. Please. Thank you so much for joining.
So much fun.
Similar topic, different way in. Three people who are devoting a lot of your lives to actively trying to help build the infrastructure that allows us to have effective civic engagement and a functional non-coin-operated democracy. Is that a fair way to describe it? Okay. So Paige, I want to start with you.
Great.
In part because as a political scientist, you know, we've got this thing, right? You're at the Carter Center, and you spend historically all this time looking around the world trying to bring American system of governance, not the same, but help make sure rule of law, transparency, human rights are respected in these countries. One of the most important things that your center is now doing is bringing those lessons back to the United States. What's that feel like?
Well, as you said, the basic precepts of democracy, those are building blocks. And when I took this job in 2020, and as Governor Hutchinson was talking about, you know, Georgia was kind of the viral soup. We had opened tattoo parlors. So much had happened in June 2020. It was the weekend after the murder of George Floyd, and the President of the United States is tear gassing Lafayette Square. And I come back from living overseas, and I called President Carter, and I said, I don't know how we're going to do elections in Guyana and Cote d'Ivoire and Venezuela if our backyard has 5-hour lines waiting to vote. And so we had a long conversation about getting involved domestically, and that was not something that for 40 years the Carter Center had done. But the need was there, and we had learned so much overseas that we wanted to bring some of those lessons home. We've monitored 125 elections in 40 different countries, and we've learned a lot with that. And so bringing those lessons home have been an interesting beginning to an organization that spent 40 years looking abroad and now taking these lessons home.
How have you been received by American officials?
It's interesting because we can walk into Liberia with a Carter Center shirt on and everyone's like, oh, the international observers are here. But if you walk into Arizona with a blue Carter Center shirt on, that is not exactly what they're saying to you. So it has been different. We do a lot of bipartisan work with the Ford Center, with Baker Center, McCain Institute, Bush. we do this bipartisan because we are nonpartisan. We're about lifting up the precepts of transparency, election integrity, and so our reception has been one, as long as we do it together with other partners, it's been much better than I think it would have been if we had tried to do this 10 years ago.
Now, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to ask you one other question just to kind of set the stage a little for what we're about to see, which is we're only a few weeks away from this election. Like a few weeks before the Venezuelan election, we were all pretty convinced that it was going to go really badly, right? How worried are you, and about what? In terms of the election integrity, the political manipulation, the potential for violence, all of these things. Talk about what you're seeing as if you were an international monitor about to hit the United States.
Well, as people say, all politics is local, all development is local. And so for someone from Georgia, even though we've seen 125 different elections, I can't go into North Carolina and convince people there are not little men in the machine changing the QR codes. That is just not something they're going to believe an organization from Atlanta says. But we've got in 6
because they're really small is the problem.
Really changing. But we've got democracy resilience networks in 6 different states, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia. But they're not ours. They're not Carter Center. It's the Michiganders for Resilience. It's the Sunshine State. It's they have created their own left and right-leaning leads and put together groups that can talk to each other and then go and have conversations with people in communities and really bring it home. That's what we've always done overseas, and that's what we're doing now, because that's where you see, when you start seeing community violence, the triggers come from certain people in the echo chambers, and if they're talking to each other, it boils up and we can hear about it. And so I'm a little worried about what happens after November 5th. I don't think any of us knew what January 6th was, or what the date or the importance of certifying an election on January 6th was until last January 6, 2021. So I think we're going to be looking at that period of time, but elections on a whole are being run better, even post-COVID. The fact that we've got 17 days of early voting, we've got no excuse absentee ballots. Lots of places have things that we did not have before COVID. And the problem is people are now questioning those. And it's actually, it can lead to disenfranchisement if people think that, oh, this is a negative. It's actually a positive. And so we can talk
It's a very different kind of challenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, Damala, I'm going to ask you about what your company does, which is really cool. But before I do, you grew up the first few years in Nigeria, in Lagos, right?
Yeah. So my immigration story, I was born in Nigeria, immigrated to the U.S. When I was 5 through what I'll call unofficial channels. So for the first 10 years, 10, 11 years in the United States, by all intents and purposes, I was a dreamer. And I've always found the term dreamer to be interesting in terms of like how they talk about us, because it wasn't my dream. I didn't wake up at like 5 years old and was like, let's go to the United States, Mom and Dad. It's really their dream, right? So they're the dreamers, are saying that they want us to have a better life in the U.S. or thought that they could provide a better life for me and my siblings in the U.S. So our immigration story is one that's, I think, very common. It's not kind of the traditional, here's the exact pathway that you follow. I spent, a lot of time with immigration lawyers, even as a kid, with my parents trying to figure things out and chart a path towards residency and eventually citizenship. So it's coming up actually on the 10th year anniversary of being a full United States citizen. I was a permanent resident for about 10 years. So really excited about that.
You're a very young dude. I didn't think you were that young, honestly. Just on the background.
I'm barely 24.
Yeah, that's crazy.
No, I'm kidding.
That's crazy. So, okay, but where I'm going with this, again, before we quite get to the company, is we were just talking a little bit about the United States historically, like exporting a lot of lessons and now looking at home. I'm wondering if you look at your parents, if you look at your family, you look at where you're originally from, a couple of lessons that you would want to offer that are relevant for Americans facing this election, facing this political environment today?
Yeah, I mean, I really consider myself a global citizen. You know, when you're an immigrant in the United States, you don't really have a choice growing up, but to have kind of an antenna up around what the civic discourse look like, what are people talking about. I mean, right now we're in a really kind of interesting immigration climate when it comes to how we talk about immigration, how we talk about migration, how we legislate that, the rules related to that. But for me, growing up, because I was so kind of civically minded and molded by that, I paid a lot of attention to where the kind of my family diaspora is. The one thing about being Nigerian, for those of you that, not those of you, everybody here probably has a Nigerian friend. We are, there's like 250 million of us, and we're all over the world. So you definitely have a
big country.
You definitely have a Nigerian friend. We're really spread out, right? Even my family diaspora, I have family in the UK, in Switzerland, in Ireland, across different parts of the African continent, in Canada, in Mexico. The kind of conversations that we had as a family were really about what is happening politically, what's happening civically in your environment, and that really shaped, and we'll talk hopefully a little bit about what my company does, but that really shaped how I thought about civic engagement and civic discourse. A lesson that I would say that's really important to note is just how important public policy transparency is. We have a really special thing going on in the United States at certain levels of government where we've already institutionalized and created a culture around publishing policy information and then being able to use that data and leverage that data to be able to help build civic engagement guardrails. So I think that's something that we can continue to do. That's something that if we close off on public policy transparency, I think we're going to fall into some really bad traps.
So I feel like you just started the transition to plural there, which is the name of the company that you started. And you're dedicating to improving the analysis of public policy documents through technology. Explain to the audience, not so they invest, but just so we understand what you're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, I won't get into the nerdy tech part. But we essentially what we do is we build AI products, data products, and software products to help everyday people be more civically engaged or policy engaged. We don't really say politically engaged. We look at it as policy and civic engagement. So what does that look like? What do our products look like? We have a bill version summarizer that uses AI to be able to understand the differences between two versions of a bill, but also to be able to identify how that bill is changing a statute and impacting an existing statute. One of our data products is an open API that takes every single bill since 1999 across federal Congress and every single state legislature, including U.S. territories, and we put that into it. We structure all of that data, and researchers across the country, from Brown University to University of Minnesota, my alma mater, to Cal, Berkeley, use that information and use that data for research purposes. The Associated Press, 100 journalists built a tool to be able to kind of identify different legislation for things that they're writing about and want to publish. So we just really kind of focus on how can we pull all this interesting public policy information, structure it, and then create AI software data products for folks to be more engaged with.
Okay. Last question before I move to Neil.
Oh, go ahead.
Stuff. No, it's good stuff, right? We want that. We need that. So I'm a little bit of a curveball here, which is I'm wondering, I assume you're tracking who's using your product.
Yes.
Okay, so that was just a yes or no question. I don't need to go anywhere with it. I want to know what you have learned about America on the basis of who you find is engaging with this and what you're doing about it.
What I would say, not to get political.
No. This is analytics.
Yeah, this is just data. We find for our free, because we open source and we provide a lot of free products. We have paid products. We have a lot of free products, and that's something that we just give to the community, give to folks to engage with. And we see a lot of far right, a lot of what I would consider kind of hate policy organizations be very, very active on public policy, more so than we see on the free side, again, more so than we see what we would consider the political left. So kind of I'll stop there, take from that what you will.
So you're apparently part of the problem, is what you're saying.
when you put it like that, I'm hoping that being in this conversation makes me part of the solution. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting information to see.
What are you doing about that? Like, first time your data guy comes in and says this, data gal comes in and says this, you're thinking, obviously, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. What are you going to do about it?
So I'll share just a really quick story. We do have a kind of terms and conditions, policy matrix that we use to be able to say like, hey, like if you're using any of our tools, products, software for any sort of malicious intent, things that are against our core focus of civic participation, public policy, which obviously includes voter participation, that we have the right to shut you down, right? Like the cool thing about being CEO, I get to do what the fuck I want. So we do have a policy. We do have a policy around that. And
Paige has that on her desk, actually. She's got a little button. That's what it says. My product team came up to me and said, "Hey, there's this organization that we, the name kind of sounded kind of interesting. They were using our free product. They were tracking a lot of bills using one of our free bill tracking software products. And they investigated and they found that it was kind of a hate group essentially against Black, brown people. It was very clear. They didn't put it on their website and say we're the KKK, but it was very clear that the work that they were doing was really anti-Black, anti-brown. And I was like, did they see our Teams page? And that was one that I was like, you know what, shut them down. And we went and turned off their access. So I mean, if it's so blatant and so obvious, and you're directly violating our terms and conditions, we're going to shut you down because I can do that if I want. Thank you. So I want to ask. Thank you for being patient.
I'm so happy to be here.
But before I ask you about points of light,
yes.
I'm seeing a flow through here that I'm concerned about, which is not that elections are falling apart, but that people don't believe them.
Yeah,
not that his product isn't awesome, but people are using them to pursue misinformation.
Yeah.
How are you experiencing that? And both with your organization, but also broadly in the country, and what do you think we need to do about it?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the organization. I'm a non-executive chairman, and we have a great CEO sitting right over here, Jennifer Sarangelo, and we'll let Jennifer speak for the organization. It concerns me. I was raised in a political family. My brother George W. ran and ended up in a very close race with Al Gore. It was contested all the way to the Supreme Court. It was rendered, there was a judgment rendered, and there was a peaceful transition. It seems like years ago now that kind of civility existed in our politics, and to think that the basic institutions of our democracy are being challenged, not just the integrity of an election, but the institutions, the FBI and various institutions of governance are being challenged, is crazy to me. It's a sign of real breakdown, and it worries me deeply.
Where does it come from?
Where does what come from? The breakdown?
Yeah.
Well, of course it comes from Donald Trump's, radical rhetoric and constant demeaning of the other side and of the political institutions. It comes from his absurd challenge of the will of the people who voted and whose votes were contested, and they were contested and proven right. It's just there's an absurd level of ego and kind of narcissism, and we live in a world of icons. The Republican Party doesn't exist anymore. I used to be a Republican. I'd like to consider myself a Republican, but if you don't show fealty to the leader, to the great leader, then you're ostracized. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on this political thing. You hit a nerve.
No,
You hit a nerve.
I hit a nerve.
You hit a nerve. You hit a nerve. I'm wondering how this is going to, settle with George W. here, as I'm talking out loud about this. I wish he would.
He's going to make a public statement, apparently.
Really?
No, I don't know that, but I was just wondering if you did. I mean, it could happen, right?
So here, another sidebar point on that. I'm honored to be at a Clinton Global Initiative. Never been here before, never been invited, never been big enough. My daughter Lauren, who you know very well,
I know very well,
has been coming here many years, and she deserves it. She's really amazing. But I say that it's such an honor because my father's relationship with Bill Clinton
was amazing.
Was amazing. It showed again how how you can disagree on certain things but still work together for a bigger and greater cause. So Bill Clinton and Dad lined up to work on tsunami and that kind of thing. In fact, he became so close to the family that he's considered a brother from another mother. And I wish so I'm glad to be at Brother Bill's thing here. But it's but it just goes to show that there used to be a day where civility was pretty prevalent, and now the whole concept of civility, watching the debates, it's just so discouraging to hear all this negativity about our country, and this is terrible, and that's terrible, and blah, 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 and it was really refreshing, and I'm showing all my colors here, to have a woman who was so sharp, and so engaged, and so knowledgeable of issues, and so affected, and actually got under his skin in a way that made me very happy. It's nice to see.
But tell me how you felt about that.
It just gives us hope that America can reject this kind of, nationalist, egotistical, narcissistic kind of behavior.
Well, you just had two governors from both sides of the aisle.
Yes.
Certainly reflect that. We have lots of people at the grassroots every day who aren't thinking about the ballot box. They're thinking about just being Americans still. I mean, I understand that you're concerned about he who must not be named at this conference, but
I just named him.
I know. But that was a little, rule that you broke, but it's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know.
But I want to know beyond that, more deeply. He's symptomatic, of something structural. He didn't bring all those problems.
No, so I believe that there has been a disenfranchisement, that people have been led to believe that they're being left out of opportunity. They're being told, and they believe that immigrants are coming into the country taking their jobs, that China is winning and we're losing. They're being told this stuff over and over and over again, and so they're falling into a trap, which I believe is based on false narratives. They've become disengaged, and it's a problem. There's polarization. There's a great depth of polarization on the political front. It's also now kind of become more exacerbated in race and in income disparity. And by the way, getting back to the topic, one of the antidotes to that is service. One of the antidotes to that is getting people, out and in community with others, being present with others. When you're with someone, even if you disagree with them, you can't help but establish some form of relationship, some kind of empathy, and that kind of thing. And so we need to put a much brighter light shining on service and how to get people to exercise their democratic necessity to be engaged in the community.
Look, I mean, I'm a writer at heart, and I see the answer is long form, right? It's not the headline, it's long form. You have to create connection. In a relationship, it's not, swipe right, swipe left.
Yes.
It's a relationship.
Yes.
It's a community. It's connection. It's immigrations you live with as opposed to point at that you've never even seen. Because Americans, when they connect like that, they engage like that.
Exactly.
Points of light, what are you doing in that regard?
Points of Light was formed in the White House by Dad. He recognized that for every problem playing out in America, there are nonprofit organizations, powered often by volunteers, that are doing good, trying to fix those problems. Points of Light right now is at the epicenter of a crisis. We have seen a dramatic decline in volunteer rates. Right now, down from 30%, only 23% of Americans formally volunteer.
In how many years?
And since the past 30 years.
Okay.
The peak was in like 2001 or whatever. So we've also seen a decline in funding for nonprofit organizations, and we've seen a dramatic increase in needs. So the needs that were being met in Dad's time when he talked about 1,000 points of light are still needing to be met. On top of that, we have an epidemic of loneliness, and we have this crisis of polarization that we've already talked about. So this layered on top of already existing problems. So the question is, how are we going to respond to that? And Points of Light, being led by Jennifer Sharangelo, is at the center of developing a national service movement, which is going to bring all the stakeholders together. We're the largest convener of people in the sector, so we get together and we talk about these very important issues. We're the largest convener of a corporate service council. Corporations are finding that they can attract, retain, and get more production out of employees that come when they know they're coming to a corporation that has, gives them a purpose, a volunteer activity and opportunity. We have the largest network of blockers and tacklers in the field, the activation centers. We have 90 activation centers around the United States. They need more funding, they need more capacity, but they're the ones that train the nonprofit organizations. They're the one that matches volunteers with volunteer opportunities. So there's an infrastructure and logistics part, there's a research and broadcasting part that we play, there's a recognition. We have Points of Light Awards, 7,900 daily Point of Light awardees have been received this recognition. Ordinary citizens that do extraordinary work. Those stories are inspiring. We do a lot, but we've got to do way more and have way much more impact given the urgency and the severity of the problem right now.
I mean, what I'm hearing on this panel, some concerns about resilience, some concerns about, sort of the foundations of the political institutions we have eroding. It's truth, it's service, it's philanthropy, it's some of the mechanisms themselves. And again, coming into this election is something that your organization studies and tries to make us more aware of and do something about. Talk about how you react to that, where the United States is in context.
Well, we're talking, the through thread here is also, political discourse has gone online and it's turned into theater. And so everyone's in their own echo chamber. Everyone's using the information that they have at hand. So how do you start cross-pollinating that? How do you do it through service, through people working together, finding a common cause? In North Carolina, they'll go on rafting trips together before they admit what their political affiliation is. And then they realize, well, if we can agree and get down a whitewater rafting trip, then obviously we should be able to trust each other. And so I think that you've got...
Depends on what happens in the whitewater rafting trip,
that's
really.
true, as long as it ended well for everyone.
Yeah.
But you've got this through thread that people are just, as you were saying, the layering, people are not talking to each other because they don't have that time together. COVID really made people go online. They're just, Winston Churchill said, when the telegram came out, a lie reaches halfway across the world before the truth can put its pants on. So that was 80 years ago. You can imagine what is happening now online when people have this, this belief of what they see. The sky's not blue, it's purple, and then everyone's convinced it's purple, or people are eating dogs, or whatever. So you've got this moment in time where if we start talking to each other, if kids and individuals start having conversations and doing service again and getting back to where we were 25 years ago in community service, you find these connections that are just missing. So for the upcoming election, that's what you have to do. It's all politics is local, all development's local. You've got to be in your local community, convincing people in Montana of things that they need convincing of, or Minnesota, sorry, which is totally different than convincing people in Georgia what they need.
So what convinced you? I mean, you're now leaning in to public service, civic engagement. I mean, you're devoting your life to it, right? At a time that seems to be swimming a little bit upstream, if I can torture that analogy a little more. What's motivating you?
I consider we all have different interests and things we're passionate about. And for me, starting Plural and building this company was the best way for me to kind of serve the civic-minded part of me, the entrepreneurial kind of interest, that part of me, and then the kind of the finance and kind of the nerdy tech side as well part of me. And for me, it was just like, hey, this is a great opportunity to be able to create something that can actually have an impact in our country and in our world. Something I didn't mention before is that we don't just have these tools in the U.S., we also have them in Nigeria and in South Africa. Nigeria for obvious reasons. South Africa because it's a big economy. It's a pretty big economy in Africa.
And transparency in public policy is also a serious need in Nigeria.
Of course.
Let's be clear, yeah.
And to that point, and to kind of circle back to what I said earlier, in Nigeria, the Nigerian National Assembly does not digitize, does not publish legislation. So we had to find kind of a backdoor method and build some relationships to literally get legislative documents that are, typed up and on paper, and OCR basically like digitize them into our platform to be able to structure that data, use AI to be able to understand it, open source some of it, so on and so forth, and kind of building up that muscle for how we can do this in other democracies that don't publish their policy information, their policy data. But to go back to your question, Ian, around like what really drove me and what can maybe drive and motivate other people, and I think it comes back to what you both just said as well, which is service. There is something that is maybe getting a little bit lost when it comes to how we think about our individual lives and how we think about our communities. And it's like we're really here to be of service to one another, to be servants to one another. It's the way that I was raised, was to be a servant leader, to be of service, to do something. My parents are pastors in our local community. I grew up in Minnesota, so in our community in Minnesota, and for them it was about service. They were caretakers. They were nurses when they moved to the U.S. They wanted to be of service. So I think going back and having conversations at the earliest stages in K through 12 education about, hey, it's really important to prioritize service, and it'll look differently for different people. For me, it took a pathway of entrepreneurship and technology, but the core of it for me is still service, creating impact, creating change, being a service to the global community. And I think that's the most important thing.
We're just about out of time, but what you just said reminds me of Neil talking about loneliness and the fact that everything you just discussed comes from an environment of the opposite of loneliness. You talked about your pastor, you talked about your family, before you talked about the diaspora, Nigeria. Everything about the way you were brought up was, I'm going to engage. I'm part of something bigger. I feel connected. And the digitization, creating ennui, creating isolation, and also creating isolation, especially among young men in this country right now. And something I feel like we're all identifying, but some of us are actually doing something about. And that's great. It was really wonderful to hear. It's great to be with all of you in the panel. Please join me in thanking Damola, Paige, and Neil. Thank you very much.